Hey, podcast listeners, Ria Wong with you once again with Nonprofit Lowdown. Today, I'm joined by two very special guests. We are talking today with Suzi Epstein, who is the managing director of field building at Robin Hood, and Kim DiPalo, who is the chief development officer at Drive Change. And we are talking about Robin Hood's GRIT program today. So, this is specifically for all of the New York nonprofits. And learning about how the GRIT program can be a support to you. So, Susie, Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Susie, I know we've had you on before, but for those of us who have yet to get to know you, can you give us a little bit of a background about yourself and this program that you're running? And then Kim will ask you the same.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me a second time. Second, I'm a longtime staffer at Robin Hood. I've actually been there for 30 years. I'm an attorney by training. My background has been in areas like criminal justice, housing, mental health, domestic violence. I became very interested in not-for-profit management early in my career as a lawyer. And as the CEO of Sanctuary for Families encountered Robin Hood in its infancy and sent them a grant proposal and got some funding. And then several years later was the 10th person to join their staff. I've assumed a number of roles there. My favorite actually is what I've been doing in the last couple of years, which is basically coaching emerging not-for-profits to get philanthropic support.
And you oversee the GRIT program. Can you give us a brief overview of what that is? And then, Kim, I'd love to talk to you about your experience.
GRIT stands for Grant Readiness Insights and Training. It's a series of workshops that cover everything from program design and learning and measurement and presenting fiscals and budgets and costs, presenting results, presenting good governance and how your board functions, to doing grant writing and cultivating individual donors. So we've organized a syllabus for emerging and early middle stage not-for-profits to go through these trainings to help them actually secure corporate foundation and individual gifts. We are in our 8th year of running the program. We have had about 80 to 85 different not-for-profits in it, and we've seen really good results from it to date.
I love that. Well, Kim, let's jump over to you. So I love your story. It's a little bit of a non-traditional journey into nonprofits. So if you could just give us a sense of your journey here and then a little bit about your experience in GRIT, because I know you are an alum of the program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ria, and excited to be here with you and Susie. So my background, I've been at Drive Change for 4 years. I'm the Chief Development Officer newly. I was previously for 4 years the Chief Operating Officer. Prior to being at Drive Change, I actually spent 22 years in hospitality. I spent my whole career in restaurants. I was a kid who dropped out of college and started waiting tables in order to, support myself, and feel very fortunate through my career to have had many, many incredible leaders who not only promoted me, but really invested in my learning. So, the longest part of my career was at Gramercy Tavern, where I started as a server, and my last role there was as the general manager, running a very large budget, all because I had people who were willing to teach me how to run a P&L and a large budget. And then eventually made it to recruiting at Union Square Hospitality Group. So I was managing the recruiting for all 20 businesses and was working with our leaders just about the way we think about hiring and investing in talent, and was working with Drive Change and Emma's Torch and Hot Bread Kitchen. So really thinking about workforce development and some non-traditional pathways into the restaurant industry. So when the COO role came up at Drive Change, I just thought it was a great opportunity. I've really wanted to get into mission-driven work and just love the work that was being done at Drive Change. So it's what really inspired me to make the move, even though I was like, oh my God, do I know what I'm doing? And
None
then
of us knows what we're doing. We're all just making it up.
yeah. And then, the most interesting part of the last couple of years for me was, we had a founder CEO transition, and our founder used to do all of the fundraising. And so I was, there was this kind of like accidental move into development, but for me, I really love it. I think it's just like hospitality in many ways. I think it's about relationships and understanding people. And so I really enjoy it. Kalila, our new executive director, and myself just went through the GRIT program, which was a great opportunity just for us to do workshops that are really deep dives into a lot of the parts, that, I've heard you say, Ria, it's like you need someone to help you learn these pieces. I've heard other people say like they don't teach development in college. That's not a course you get to take. So having the opportunity to go through the program and really spend time, and like we've done a lot of the one-on-one work to just dive a little deeper into our specific needs, which has been really cool.
I love that so much. And actually, it's funny you mention it because Danny Meyer is someone that I really look to as far as the philosophy behind how I think about fundraising, which is exactly right. How do you connect with people? How do you make people feel special? How do you make them feel a part of something? So we'll talk about that a bit more. So, Suzi, back to you. Right now, you are recruiting for the GRIT program. So, can you give us a sense of who would be the ideal person to apply for GRIT, and what kind, like, what stage might they be in that would most benefit from the GRIT program?
I'm going to answer it by substituting organization for person, because the cohort is filled with very diverse leaders with different levels of experience and different backgrounds in terms of missions they've been involved with or expertises that they have. What we're looking for is organizations whose budgets are between $1 and $20 million who have limited private support. So a $10 million agency that gets half of its funding from foundations, $5 million from different philanthropies, wouldn't be the optimal candidate. We're looking for organizations whose budgets are maybe only 20% from philanthropic or individual donors. And the reason for that is because that is such an inflection point and such a place where there's clear need to diversify revenue streams. No matter what your total resources are, that kind of proportion is a place where if you want to be resilient and you want to start new programs and services that may not be underwritten by the public sector, you want to be able to bring in private money to do that.
And can you just give us a sense, sort of tactically, what is the application process? What's the application due date and so forth?
Absolutely. So our next cycle of GRIT starts on May 2nd. The GRIT application is on Robinhood's website now. The due date is March 15th. The application is fairly simple, takes maybe 2 hours to complete. We asked for a couple of attachments that include a board list and your audit and budget, but it's a number of questions on an organization's strengths and weaknesses and what they would like to address. We interview every group that applies because we do, this is a very kind of personal, bespoke, hands-on relationship. We do talk to the groups. We'll make decisions in mid-April so that organizations can kind of configure their calendars so that they can attend the GRIT program. It will meet twice a week throughout May, from May 2nd to June 1st. The sessions are mornings on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They're hybrid. We're going to have half of them in person and half of them remote. We also, I'm getting into a little more nitty-gritty here, but we also offer individual office hours with the presenters in each workshop, and myself and another Robinhood senior staffer are available to meet with groups and to coach them actually in perpetuity, so that it's a serious long-term relationship if you'd like that.
You know, I like long-term relationships. So Kim, having successfully completed the GRIT program, can you speak to how you feel like it's helped drive change?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think, I mean, the workshops are incredible, especially they're focused in a lot of the areas that we just knew we needed and wanted support. So everything from individual fundraising to board governance to like understanding how to like get your metrics and actually present them in a way that is meaningful. But I think for us, it was especially like those one-on-one. So it's great when you're going into a workshop and there's opportunity to ask questions, but like for us to then do the office hours and take what we learned and actually apply it and ask questions that were very specific to drive change, I think was what was really helpful for us to be able to say like, can you look at this grant that we've written and tell us like what maybe needs some tweaking, or what is a way to open a grant that actually can have a greater impact, and understanding like, the individual giving, like, what does it look like to actually like cultivate a relationship, and what should that look like? Because like you said, a lot of people who, like myself, who've never done this before, you're kind of figuring it out. And if you don't have any guidance, right, someone saying like, how many times should you reach out to an individual donor? What is the right way to do it? What does this look like? How do you make an ask and not feel like, ah? So I think those have been the really like impactful parts for us. Even like writing, looking at how our budget is written has been really amazing too. And like, what's the appropriate way to present it in a grant?
Yeah, that's really helpful because, I say this a lot, which is kind of how I started my business, which is we have so many accidental fundraisers out there, right? People who have been put in these very important positions working on some of the most important issues in society without any training. It's kind of mind blowing. So it's great that Grit is out here doing that. Susie, can I switch back to you? So, you know, I know Robinhood well. I know that you, as an organization, are incredibly data driven. Can you give me a sense of what kind of metrics and outcomes you've seen from the GRIP program?
Yes, and I'm going to say that those outcomes have been both, I'm going to call them quantitative and qualitative. Yes, everyone knows Robinhood has taken a strong stand on evaluation. A program like GRIT is harder to evaluate, especially in the short term, because raising money can be dramatically quick, especially in crises, post Hurricane Sandy, post pandemic, post September 11th. On the other hand, cultivating donors can be, glacially slow. But we did do a 5-year survey after the 5th year of GRIT, in which we queried participants to date on new money that they had raised, and the number of new foundations and total philanthropic support they had raised. And we're actually thrilled to learn that of the 50 or so groups in the first 5 years, they'd raised a total of $12 million. It averaged about 400,000 per group. There was a huge range where several groups maybe got 5 or 6 new supporters, but a total $50,000, and several got 1 or 2 new sources of support, but they were close to 7 figures. So no particular patterns, but a nice amount of money. That's on the quantitative side. Qualitatively, we saw a lot of progress across many groups on governance issues, reconfiguring their boards, doing board report cards on activism and fundraising and meeting attendance and sharing committees. A lot of groups thought about fundraising efficacy and reconfiguring their offices. Maybe they needed another grant writer. Maybe they needed fewer grant writers because things were not so productive. Groups that thought about their fiscal offices. Many of them actually moved from having a bookkeeper to a controller or a CFO. That was a huge thing in terms of budget sizes. There were groups that thought much more carefully and strategically about evaluation, thought about cost per outcome, thought about the price points of different elements of the program, thought about the proportion of management in general of overhead to program. So there were, you could see a lot of the learning and a lot of the applications of lessons from grit being implemented. And that was hugely gratifying. And I would say probably 2/3 of the cohort made enormous strides in several different management arenas.
That's really helpful. Kim, I'm wondering could you speak to any specific changes that you made at Drive Change as a result of the GRIT program?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll speak, especially for myself moving into development. I think the biggest part was looking at what systems didn't exist, because especially on our individual donors, and even thinking about like when I'm writing grants, that having a really good solid like grant that you can pull from, that you're not rewriting every single time, is like something that if someone never tells you that, you're kind of like doing it over and over again. But for us, it's like building fundraising plans rather than just it being very like we never really tracked any of it, and the system hasn't existed. So we've taken those pieces. We also, for me, the budget one was incredible. I think Khalil and I both were like, wow, just the way that budgets were laid out and really breaking out our programs so that we could see, because we run 3 really different, but all tied together in some way, right? They're all centered around food, but they have like our fellowship is very different from our food distribution and different from our hospitality for social justice. And so looking at like, how do we actually break those out? So it's really clear to a funder, to anyone who would want to look at our budget, where and how money is being spent. So I think that was one that was really helpful for us. And I know we're looking at building our board. So board governance and report cards like Suzi's talking about, like those are all pieces that we're putting into play like right now, which has been exciting. Khalila's in her first year, just completed her first year as an executive director, a new executive director. So I know there's so much learning that's being done. And again, like I'm in a new role. So it helped us like take pieces like directly and be like, okay, we're going to use this and we're going to go with that. So
I'm just going to underscore something that you're saying, Kim. If I could, since I joined you and Khalila in one of the meetings in which we talked about fiscals and costs. And it was incredibly gratifying kind of when something clicked about cost per person, where we said like, okay, this is what you spend on your program, and you have 80 people in the program or 40 people in the program. We're going to do the math. Now we're going to say what part of that cost is stipends, what part of that cost is training, what part of that cost is overhead. And I think those eurekas that organizations encounter is something that is very important for them, very meaningful to us, kind of when, it all comes together. And I think we'll move a lot of not-for-profits light years ahead of where they were in terms of raising money. When you can say that to a funder, they automatically can do less due diligence and actually feel more confidence in the management savvy of an applicant.
Well, and I imagine too that going through the GRID program is kind of a good housekeeping seal of approval, given the fact that Robinhood is just such a major player in the philanthropic space in New York City. So, Suzi, I'm wondering if we could sort of zoom out a little bit. I'm curious from your standpoint at Robinhood. I think when we last spoke, I can't remember, were we at the beginning of the pandemic? I can't quite remember.
The pandemic, yeah.
Yeah,
It was about 3.5 years ago.
Yeah, so since we've spoken, the world has changed dramatically. We've had a global pandemic. We've had a racial reckoning, post George Floyd, we've seen inflation. We've seen the collapse of the crypto markets a little bit, not collapse, let's just say pulling back the crypto markets. So I'm curious from your standpoint, what do you think has changed since we've last spoken from a philanthropic funding perspective? And then what do you see moving forward?
Wow. Okay, so changes that I've seen post-pandemic in terms of philanthropy, I think are number one, more thoughtful commitments to community building and probably to combating racism. I certainly see more allocations towards initiatives that on some level combat racism, whether that's education reform or criminal justice reform or housing, banking reform, financial literacy, stuff like that. I also see fewer strings attached to grants, fewer report requirements, an interest in inputs as well as outputs, which is something we certainly moved away from over the last several decades. But now, because many grants are oriented more towards survival and are relief oriented, you're looking at inputs and efforts as well as more than a particular deliverable or impact. I see more cash grants to individuals because relief and survival are so critical. And I probably see, as part and parcel of evaluation and measurement, questions about learnings so that adjustments and diagnostics can be made in terms of program design, or cash allocations. But not so much evaluation in uppercase letters. So I'd say those are probably the 3 or 4 things that I've most seen.
And I'm just wondering
And for
if
the
you
future, there was a second part to the question.
Yeah, but actually, let's put a pin in that because I think that's a whole other question. Just a follow-up question here, because I think from my perspective, I've seen a lot of conversations around, yes, double clicking on everything that you said, and also sort of the sense of trust-based philanthropy, and a more intentional focus on BIPOC leaders and Black-led organizations. Is that an area that Robin Hood is also focused on?
Yes. Robin Hood a few years ago launched a power fund for leaders of color. We've always been very mindful of community leaders, and spent a lot of time in our due diligence looking at staffs and leadership, as well as an organization's model and evaluation. Certainly one of the things that we saw was that there was not diversity of leaders across our portfolio. And we are looking and very hard at penetrating communities throughout the 5 boroughs, and to looking at atypical Indigenous leaders who may not have several graduate degrees, or who may not have decades of experience as CEOs, but nonetheless have founded or have joined organizations that are the lifeblood and heartbeat in their communities. And we are spending a great more time and resource, on those leaders. It is also one of the reasons that we did launch GRIT, in terms of trying to impart some of the more technical management pieces of information to those groups in a both an individual and cohort kind of style, so that they could compete perhaps with more savvy and experienced leaders who had access to where the power and the money are in terms of corporate and long-term philanthropies.
Thanks for that. Kim, question for you, sort of anecdotally, what I've been hearing from a lot of my colleagues in the space is that sort of this last quarter, they saw a little bit of a pullback in terms of private philanthropy and specifically individuals. I think that there's kind of this sense of, oh, the pandemic's over. And, and I think the last quarter we saw some turbulence in the economy. Just wondering, what are you seeing as trends in the last year from your own fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we see these, like, of course, as things change in the world, people's decisions change, I mean, we've looked at, like, even our individual donors in 2020, there was a huge spike, right? And then not as much right after that. And so trying to think about how do we make sure. I also, to speak a little to what Suzi was saying, like, I appreciate one of the things, just the way that I think philanthropy has made some changes, right? Post-pandemic, where it is, like you were saying, trust-based, where there is this, like, I think there are funders who are moving to multi-year grants rather than a one time and then that's it. Fewer, like, reports, the reports have changed too. I think they're really interesting, like some questions that are being asked more around leadership and the board, demographics of what that looks like. And also just, like, for me, one of the things that I'm seeing more that I appreciate is just, like, transparency, like, from the get-go of, like, where there's alignment or what the relationship's going to look like. Cause I do think that that's something that's really helpful for us. Like, when I meet with a funder and they tell me right away, like, this is going to be a 5-year, like, relationship. It's nice to know that right away, because we know what we're getting into. And I think that's probably the truth for anyone, right? You like to know what it's like when someone tells you, they're not looking for a long-term relationship. It's kind of the same, like, at least you know what you're getting into, right? If you're looking to get married, but I'm not, maybe we don't belong together.
Oh,
So
I love a
yeah.
dating analogy.
Yeah, I think that, and for me, again, like, being new, I'm trying to it's always about understanding relationships, like what people hope. And I think it's about what people need, right? Like, you have to understand what a person is looking for, even when they're giving, like, because people don't have to give. So what does it look like to really tap into, like, what moves their heart is what's important, I think. So figuring out what that looks like, even in bad times, because I think, again, 2020 was a terrible time, but I think it motivated people to do more.
Yeah, it's interesting how crisis sort of brings out the best in people. So Susie, to follow up on the question that we were starting down the path of, what do you see as the future of philanthropy? Any trends that you could spot for us that our audience might find relevant?
Um, well, I think there's even more cognizance of the power of private resources. Um, Private resources have a huge positive benefit I think, in the world of service provision and philanthropy. And I think that the more there is awareness of that, the more there's motivation to give. I think that private philanthropy can help underwrite pilots and new ideas that are small, that government may not yet have an interest in, because it's not scaling and touching the lives of thousands of people. I think that can be very, very sexy to foundations and individual contributors alike. And I think that the more that is in the zeitgeist, the better that is, and that's something that seems to be more revealed. So that's one thing. I think there's changing ways to give, and the range from crowdsourcing to social media giving, is very powerful and very positive. I also think, and this is kind of a paradox, that there's increased trust-based philanthropy, and most people are honest and frank and cost efficient in the ways that they allocate money, but there's also corruption and misuse of funds. And I think that the balance between accountability and scrutiny of both the ways to raise money and the ways to invest money are probably going to emerge in the zeitgeist. I think the targets rotate all the time. I've been in the not-for-profit world for almost 50 years. Everything old is new again. So, I can't, but I do think that there's often donor fatigue on different issues. And being at Robin Hood for a long time, I actually think there's some fatigue around poverty fighting. And so you have to think about ways to present issues as old wine in a new flask, really. So that issues maybe of criminal justice, or housing or mental health are now about systemic barriers and social and racial injustice. So I do think that probably wordsmithing is going to be, I love words, but I do think that's going to be, a huge issue in the future. I think that donors are very interested in the future of the world and the future for their children. So I think there's much more giving towards environmental justice and green initiatives than I had seen, several decades ago. And I do think people are also interested in things that influence their own happiness and well-being in future. And we hear a lot of donors give us feedback about their interests in their own alma maters, or the illness that touches their family, or their joy in dance or music. And I think that that for those of us doing social services have to think about ways to kind of pitch those particular themes against things that might be more about beauty and happiness, perhaps. So yeah.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. But yeah, I think, Kim, to your earlier point, ultimately, everyone has a story and everyone has something that they want in the world. I mean, we all think of ourselves as the heroes of our own movies. And so the question is, how do we position ourselves as the vessel through which, the guide through which we can help facilitate our donors' stories about who they are and what they want in the world? Ladies, this has been so fun. Suzi, so folks can go on the website to apply, and this is only for New York-based nonprofits, correct?
Correct. Yes.
And is there a particular issue area that folks should be coming from?
We are not limiting missions in this round of grit. Occasionally we say groups that only serve families and children, or only but this cohort is for groups whose budgets are between 1 and 20 million. One way or another, here's what we learned: everybody's serving individuals and families. So we have not put a limit on who the clients are or what the particular intervention is. Thank you for asking that.
Very good. And if folks have questions about grit, is there a way to get in touch with you or someone at Robin Hood to ask any further questions? Are you hosting information sessions?
The grit application has info at Robin Hood. We are forwarded particular requests. We will call prospective applicants or write them back with to answer their queries. There are 2 of us on this almost full time for the next 4 months. We're actually also running 2 grit sessions this year in the spring and in the fall. So that if we, have a huge class of applicants, and can't fit them all in the spring, we will offer them an opportunity post-August to be in the next cycle.
Very good. And just so that we have an idea, how big is the cohort and how many applications are you getting per spot?
The cohort will be 12 to 15 organizations. The last several cycles during COVID, we had probably about 50 applicants, so 1 out of 3. I'm going to say this. We don't necessarily take the strongest applicant. The strongest applicants are organizations that we think will benefit the most. So when people say, why didn't I get in? My budget is so-and-so, and I have fabulous staff, and my evaluation is so excellent, my systems are you're not getting into grit. You don't need it. We're looking at groups that really, really can optimize the workshops. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, we will make sure to put the information in the show notes. So New York-based nonprofits between 1 and 20 million, which is probably everyone almost. Check it out.
Only 20% private funding.
Oh, yes, and only 20% private funding. So those are the parameters. If that is you, check it out. We'll include the information in the show notes. But until then, Suzi, Kim, thank you so much for joining. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you. I agree.
And thank you for doing this for the nonprofits in New York City. It's the place I've come to call home, and I love it and never bet against New York City.
Never.
Take care.
Thank you.